Praise be to God. Today's Bible reading portion is taken from Deuteronomy chapter 22 to 26. In chapter 22, we can come across the various laws and commands as the Lord ordains to the people of Israel. Chapter 22 verses 1 to 12 states that if an Israelite found a lost animal or garment, he was not to ignore it and pass by, but he was told to assist in returning the lost item to its owner. Men were not allowed to wear women's clothing, and women were not allowed to wear men's clothing. Anyone who dressed as the opposite gender was an abomination to the Lord. The Israelites were to build parapets, that is, protecting walls, on their roofs so that no one would fall off. Vineyards were to be planted with only one type of seed. The Israelites were not to plow their fields with an ox and a donkey yoked together. In verses 13 to 30, it states the laws concerning sexual misconduct. Now, if a man accused his wife of deceiving him and not being a virgin when he married her, the woman's father was to bring evidence of her virginity to the elders of the city. If the evidence was provided, the husband who made the false accusation was to be whipped. In the city, if a man and a woman were into sexual contact, they were to be betrothed to another man or the same woman, and the woman did not cry out for help. Both the man and the woman were to be put to death if they did not follow the law. A man was forbidden from sleeping with his father's wife, and a man was seized an unbetrothed virgin and slept with her, he was required to pay her father 50 shekels of silver, marry the woman, and he was never allowed to divorce her. Moving to chapter 23, it talks about the exclusion from the assembly of the Lord. Individuals with deformities, injuries, and certain wounds were excluded from the assembly of the Lord. These individuals included men with crushed or cut off genitals, those from both forbidden unions of the Ammonites and the Moabites. The Israelites were to treat Edomites and the Egyptians as friends. The Edomites because they were the relatives, and the Egyptians because Israel lived in their land. In verses 9 to 14, it talks about keeping the war camp holy. When the Israelites went to war and set up camp, the area was to be kept from uncleanliness and unholiness. Moses said this was because God was present with the army to give them victory over their enemies. In verses 15 to 25, it outlines the various laws and commandments. Now, if a runaway slave fled to Israel for refuge, the Israelites were not to require to return him or her to the foreign master, but the Israelites were forbidden to become cult prostitutes. Wages made from this was not to be given to the god to fulfill a vow or a sacrifice. If a person made a vow to God, they were to fulfill it quickly. If walking through a neighbor's vineyard, a person could not eat the grapes but was allowed to eat them at a very minimal part, they were not allowed to bring a big bag to collect them in bulk. Whereas, if they were walking through a neighbor's grain field, a person could eat the ears of grain, but they weren't allowed to harvest the neighbor's crops with a sickle. From this, we move on to chapter 24. Again, it continues with the different laws and commandments. Verses 1 to 22, it again talks about how a man, if he divorced his wife, he was not allowed to marry her again if she remarried and her second husband died or divorced her. Israelites were not allowed to take their neighbors' millstones as collateral for a loan because they were an essential part of a daily life. If a Hebrew kidnapped another Hebrew and forced them into slavery or sold them, the kidnapper was to be executed. When a case of leprosy was found in Israel, the people were to be careful to heed the instructions of the priest and deal it with the way the Lord had prescribed. A creditor was not to take a poor man's garment as a pledge and keep it overnight. In the same way, mistreating poor workers was forbidden. Wages were to be paid the same day they were earned. Parents could not put to death for the sins of their children and vice versa. The Israelites were not to take advantage of foreigners, widows, or orphans. They were to remember how they were once mistreated as slaves in the land of Egypt. If a Hebrew farmer harvested his crops and forgot one of the grain sheaves in the field, he was not to return to the field to recover it, but he was to leave it to the poor. When olives were harvested, the farmer wasn't to return to the trees a second time to ensure that he picked all the olives. He was to leave the remainder for the needy. Vineyard owners were not to strip their vines after the harvest. They were to leave them for less fortunate of their community. Moving from chapter 24, in chapter 25, it continues again with the laws and the commandments, stating from verses 1 to 19. Now, if a man was found guilty of wrongdoing and was sentenced to punishment of whipping, his beating was to be proportional to his crimes, but no one was to be whipped more than 40 times. When an ox was used to tread grain, they were not to be muzzled, but they were to be allowed to eat while working. If a man died but didn't have a son to carry forward his family name, his brother was responsible for marrying his widow and raising up offspring in the name of the deceased brother. If a brother refused to fulfill this responsibility, the whole household would be shamed in Israel. If two men were fighting and the wife of one man grabbed the other man, their hand was to be cut off. The Israelites were forbidden from having weights and measures that weren't accurate. And God told the Israelites to destroy the Amalekite nation when they entered Canaan, because the Amalekites attacked Israel on the way of Egypt when they were faint and weary. Adding on to that, in chapter 26, we talk from verses 1 to 19. It portrays the first fruits of the promised land and the third year of tithe. When the Israelites took possession of the promised land and made it their home, they were to bring a basket of the first fruits of their harvest to the priests at God's appointed place of worship. When the basket was given to the priest, the offerer was to declare God's faithfulness in giving his people the land of Canaan. The basket was taken by the priest and laid at the altar, and when this was complete, the offerer was to rehearse the history of the Israelite nation and acknowledge God's hand in leading them from Egypt to the promised land. In the third year, the Israelites were to bring the tithes of their produce into the towns and share them with the Levites, orphans, widows, and the poor. After doing this, they were to declare before the Lord that they had kept his instructions and ask him to bless the ground where their crops grew. If the Israelites would keep these instructions and promise to follow God faithfully, he promised to bless their land, give them prosperity, and to elevate them above other nations. Now this brings us to the end of chapter 26. I hope it was useful to all. Thank you all for listening once again, and God bless.